Good evening and welcome to all of you here and those of you joining us on Zoom. I'm Nancy Kennedy, Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, or OLLI, here at Furman. We provide non-credit courses, travel, social opportunities, and special interest groups for more than 2,500 senior adults here in the Greenville area. One of the hallmarks of our program is discussions on current events and contemporary issues. I'm glad our members explore various issues and hold respectful civil discussions as they learn from each other. To further this, we have for the past 11 years worked with the Riley Institute to present a summer lecture series that examines current issues affecting us in Greenville, in South Carolina, and in the nation. We have a great program in store for you. Tonight's title is Structural Racism, Impeding the American Dream for Us All. We invite you to ask questions. You can visit the link on the screen and then hit the Ask a Question button to log your questions for tonight's speakers. We'll begin with a discussion with Heather McGhee, economic and social policy expert and author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, and the Honorable Richard Riley, former governor of South Carolina and U.S. Secretary of Education. Dr. Ken Peterson will moderate this discussion. He serves as Furman's Vice President of Academic Affairs and Provost, but tonight we're asking him to wear his Professor of Economics hat for this discussion. The second part of tonight's program will be a conversation with Megan Barp, President and CEO of the United Way of Greenville County, the Honorable Lillian Brock Fleming, Mayor Pro Tem with Greenville City Council, and David Lominack, Market President of South Carolina for TD Bank and co-chair of Greenville County's Racial Equity and Economic Mobility Commission. Felicia Eady of South Carolina Public Radio will moderate their discussion, which is focused on our own community. Thanks again for joining us tonight. And now I'll turn things over to Ken Peterson.
Thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to welcome you tonight to the second installment of this year's Straight Talk series. Straight Talk is a program offered by the Riley Institute and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Furman in partnership with South Carolina ETV. And I want to express my gratitude to our organizers and to our partners tonight. So let's give them a big hand. Last week, we heard from Jeffrey Robinson, Monica Bell, and Brittany Arciniega, who helped us understand how a set of laws, practices, institutions, and cultural norms at the federal, state, and local levels over hundreds of years resulted in physical harm, higher rates of incarceration, and premature deaths for Black people. And they systematically limited the access of Black people to opportunities such as good education, good jobs, home and land ownership, and credit at reasonable terms. These in turn have inhibited the ability of those affected to accumulate wealth and thus have limited the potential for investments in children's well-being and intergenerational wealth transfers. Such systemic inequalities limit the opportunities of the next generation, beginning literally at birth. In other words, structural racism gives rise to structural inequalities and inequities. And these are perpetuated not because of the personal attributes of the people experiencing them, but because of the unequal footing one experiences at the beginning of life and the asymmetries and opportunity that are perpetuated afterwards. In a moment, I will introduce Heather McGhee, who will soon join our conversations. Her book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, argues that the harmful impacts of racism extend beyond Black people, even when Black people were the principal targets of the racist policies. By extension, the benefits of alleviating racism are also more widely distributed. In essence, she argues that the elimination of structural racism is a positive sum, not a zero-sum activity. In a moment, Heather can share more about the positive sum nature of the removal of racist laws, policies, and practices. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Secretary Dick Riley, who's sitting with me here on stage. Actually, Dick needs no introduction. Beloved by the people across the state and around the nation, he is known for his ability to build partnerships and bring people together to get things done. And as he demonstrated during his 8 years as governor of South Carolina and 8 more as U.S. Secretary of Education. Dick, it's an honor to share the stage with you this evening. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you.
I'm also delighted to welcome as our guest Heather McGhee. Heather is a wise and widely sought after speaker and social and economic policy expert who designs and promotes solutions to inequality in America. Her most recent book, The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, spent 10 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. An influential voice in media, an NBC contributor, and a confessed data nerd, by the way, Heather regularly appears on NBC's Meet the Press and MSNBC, and she has shared her opinions, writing, and research in numerous outlets, including the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Politico, and National Public Radio. Currently the chair of the board of Color of Change, she is a hard speaker to get, but when Secretary Riley invited her to come be part of the Straight Talk series, she said yes. Did I mention that Dick Riley can bring people together? Heather, thank you so much for being with us here this evening. We really appreciate it. So Heather, let me start with a question. We're really delighted to have you as part of this conversation, and I'd like to ask you a little bit about your story. So we like to talk a lot here at Furman about pathways. That is, what are the things that led you to the place that you are now, how you think and what you're doing. And so if you could just take a moment and tell us a little bit about your pathway that led you into this conversation today, we'd very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Ken, for the question. Thank you to everyone who is part of this conversation tonight. You know, it's conversations like these, right? Event series like these that give ordinary people a way to engage in ideas, to sit back and think about the world that we have inherited and how it affects their community. And to do so with neighbors, you know, who you may not always agree with all the time, that are absolutely the lifeblood of our big experiment in self-governance in this country. And I'm just so moved every time I can be a part of them. And of course, to you, Honorable Governor Riley, it's really a pleasure to be with you virtually. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person, but your contributions to our country and to your state really precede you. And so I'm really glad to be in this conversation with you tonight. So let me get to your question first. So my path is one that started where I was born on the south side of Chicago. I was born in a family that traces itself back to enslaved people on both sides of my family, from Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Moved up in a story that is very, you know, shared by millions of African Americans during the Great Migration to the Midwest, where the jobs were and where safety was. And you know, I also, though, was very shaped by the time in which I grew up, which was the 1980s, when the lights on the American dream really began to fade, where we really began to see the massive economic dislocation of factories closing and being shipped overseas, of cutbacks to public sector jobs, really starting to hollow out the middle class, particularly in neighborhoods like mine on the south side of Chicago that had just gotten their shot at the middle class just one generation before, and that didn't have very much intergenerational wealth to fall back on and cushion the blows. And so it sparked in me from a young age a curiosity and urgency about the economy, actually, about why it was that so many people around me in my community were working so hard to make ends meet and yet really didn't feel like they were keeping their heads above water. And so I was very, very lucky through a bunch of twists and turns to end up with an entry-level job at a startup think tank in 2002 called Demos. I was the first hire in the Economic Opportunity Program. And I would then go on to spend the better part of the next 2 decades helping to build that organization. I went to law school, and then I became president of it when I was 33 years old. And really our aim as part of that organization was to do research and public policy and some litigation, all to advance solutions to inequality in America, inequality in our economy and our democracy, because we saw those two things as really inextricably linked. And the tools that I learned to use were research, statistics, again, the sort of data nerd that you referenced, learn to basically be able to study a problem and craft evidence-based solutions and then bring those to decision makers and basically hope that they made better economic policy decisions. And yet it really felt like so often, year after year, things were getting worse for American families. It was getting harder to make ends meet. 1% of the population owns more wealth than the entire middle class, while 40% of adult workers before the pandemic weren't paid enough to meet their basic needs for things like food and housing. And yet our economy was creating a ton of wealth while it was really becoming more and more difficult, particularly for working class people, young people, rural people to get, and people of color to get ahead. And so the path that took me to being able to have this conversation with you all really took a sort of jagged turn in 2017 when I made the somewhat unexpected decision to give up my dream job running the organization where I'd grown up, and hand over the reins and set off on a series of journeys across the country, from California to Mississippi to Maine and back again many times, really in some ways trying to think differently about the questions that I'd been asking myself and working on for my entire career. And that journey is the journey that became the book, The Sum of Us. It was a journey to try to figure out why we have so much inequality, why it seems like we can't have nice things, why does the greatest country in the world, in my opinion, not do what is sort of basic and required to ensure a decent standard of living for our people. Why do we not have universal affordable health care and child care? Why do we still have poverty wages? Why is it that we don't have a well-funded school in every neighborhood? What's going on? Why is there so much dysfunction in a society that invented the American dream and in a society that certainly has enough money and resources, has been truly blessed? Why do we still fight over whether or not $7.25 an hour is enough to pay somebody, right? What's going on? And the answer, as you alluded to in the opening, is that I found that racism, not so much as we normally think of it, kind of a dispute of prejudice and bias between two people, but rather racism in our politics and in our policy making has unexpectedly led to distortions of the way we solve problems together and has made our country stingier than it should be to all of us, not just to people of color. And so racism's fingerprints I found really on so many of our most vexing public problems, from the economy to the environment to the funding for public college, and the list really went on and on.
That's a great introduction, Heather. So hold that thought. We're going to come back to those very ideas in just a second. Secretary Riley, you've spent your entire life advocating for quality education for all children, and you had great success improving public education in South Carolina as governor. You were described as one of the most effective and best ever cabinet secretaries in U.S. history by Time magazine. What would you say the role of public education is in addressing some of these issues of inequity?
Well, of course, I'm a strong believer in public schools, and it's very clear to me that all of these issues, we're really talking about inequities. It all is built around education and the opportunities for education and many other factors, obviously, healthcare or whatever. But the public schools really hold the fundamental reason that we are talking about inequities in this country and in this state. When I came here after being in Washington for 8 years under Bill Clinton, we started the Raleigh Institute, which I was very proud. David Shire was the president, and Ken and all those, Don Gordon. And the whole theme of the main thing, we have like 15 or 16 different programs. All of them deal in one way or another with education, public education generally. But we got into the word diversity. And I know it's kind of a soft word. We had some real stringent discussion of race last week, and it was good that we heard that. But my feeling about South Carolina and what I could do coming out of Washington and out of the governor's office was to try to get the people who are having trouble living together equally, that are having difficulties in many ways, when it's very clear to me that by putting diverse people together, having them know each other, having them work together, and so forth. So we started the Diversity Leadership Initiative, and an awful lot of people here that have done that. It's like a 5-month program, meeting one day a month, and then afterwards too. But it deals with this business of training people how important diversity is and how it can solve a lot of these problems. You have to go beyond that. But it's amazing to me how that's so important, and it's so important to have public education for all children. I am very strong about what we're doing now. Some things, the early childhood effort is tremendous. I really think well of that. The other efforts that we have with community schools and all of the other things that bring people together all make a difference. But certainly, public education is at the seat of just about everything we're talking about.
Thank you, Dick. It seems to me that the DLI program and the format in which it's offered, where people spend a significant amount of time together talking about shared problems, working on shared projects, aligns really well with the spirit of Heather's book, in that that seems to be a very important avenue by which we discover the commonality among us, even though we might come from different backgrounds. Is that your sense of the program as well?
Absolutely. And as I read the book, I did read your book, Heather, and I enjoyed it a great deal. And thank you for being here. And Furman zoomed in, and we appreciate that so much. But your book really is about diversity in a sense, but you, of course, are an economic person and sociology mixed together. But it's the first time I've really ever analyzed this business of people can't seem to work well together, which is absolutely truth in this country right now. But it is a real positive way of saying, well, we can do that. We can work together. And we can then have this solidarity dividend that you write about. And everybody benefits, as you point out, time and time again in so many different ways. Yes, I think diversity is a part of that, but you have to go further. And diversity, I think, for South Carolina and in this country is a good way to start really moving everybody together.
Thank you, Dick. Heather, let's pick up on a couple of the issues that you highlight in your book. You know, last week we heard about redlining, for example, as an element in our American economic and social history. And, you know, we like to think that redlining is something in our past, right? But you have an example in your book of predatory lending practices. And I was wondering if you could just illuminate that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about how those practices played out in the conversations that you had with people.
Sure, I'd be happy to. You know, this is from a chapter that I wrote that in many ways is the nearest and dearest to my heart, because it reflects the issues that I was working on with great frustration for the first half of my career, for a decade, which was basically studying a problem that was going on in neighborhoods across the country, which was that in the wake of finally ending official redlining, which happened in the 1970s, redlining being when the federal government said, these are the neighborhoods that are bad credit risks because there are Black people and other people of color in them. They never substantiated that. They never proved it. They just said, well, obviously, people shouldn't, banks shouldn't lend in those areas because there's something wrong with those people. And that created this massive gap in home ownership, right? If the federal government is saying, here, let me offer insurance to banks to lend in these places. Let me offer subsidies to developers to build, houses and apartment buildings that workers can afford, and yet let's ban Black people from being a part of that. You're going to have, intergenerational wealth be sort of stacked up on one end of the ledger, and then really have all of these hurdles to creating it in Black communities. And so really soon after the end of redlining, we had deregulation of our financial products. We used to have limits on interest rates and fees, and they were sort of a part, I think, of this larger kind of anti-government ethos that came in the wake of the civil rights movement, and that really helped to usher in the inequality era, the sense that, let's just see what happens if we let Wall Street write their own rules. And so there were created these new lending companies. And of course, then our normal banks got in on the action. But what ended up happening was they started developing these new mortgage products. These were not 30-year fixed rate mortgages. These were these exotic new loans with strange new terms. And where they started targeting with aggressive marketing was in Black neighborhoods, where there were people who already owned their homes, and they started there because those were equity-rich homeowners, people sitting on their houses who were marketed refinance loans, saying basically, hey, I see you're going to have to do a roof repair sometime in the next 10 years. Why don't I refinance that mortgage so you can get a little money for that repair? I see you've got a kid going to college next year. You're going to need to pay for that. Why don't I refinance that mortgage, consolidate all your payments? But what I don't tell you is that it's a 10% interest rate, a 12% interest rate, that there's a prepayment penalty, a balloon payment that's due in 18 months of $100,000. All of these tricks and traps started in Black communities. And I had the very strange misfortune of being part of a group of advocates who were working on that issue back when nobody was paying attention, in the early 2000s. When the sort of fire of subprime loans was working its way through Black, equity-rich, middle-class neighborhoods across the country. And regulators, they had spent so much time being taught that Black people were bad credit risks that when they began to see high levels of foreclosure in those neighborhoods, they kind of chalked it up, right? They said, well, yeah, that's what happens. We put those people into homes that they shouldn't been able to afford, right? And there was just a way in which the stereotype blinded people to what the evidence was really showing, was that this was a new kind of mortgage loan. It was built to fail. It was dangerous. It was making a lot of money for Wall Street, but it was fundamentally unsustainable. And for me, the story, that hidden story that most people actually don't know about what led up to the financial crisis, because then once we had the sort of wheels were off the car, there was so much money being made that it began to just run roughshod over the rest of the country. And then you had white, suburban, middle class, upper middle class families doing these loans as well, much larger part of the mortgage market. And then it was really out of control. It was sort of too late. But that was one of my most kind of acute and frankly devastating examples in my career of seeing how racism ultimately has a cost for everyone. And racism driven by greed is one that makes people do things that they normally wouldn't do. It makes them blind to the evidence that's right in front of them. It excuses behavior that they wouldn't do with someone that they sort of held in the same esteem that they hold their own family. And it ultimately has a cost for everyone, right? I mean, we are still seeing in our society the ways in which the financial crisis still is having an impact. People who lost their homes in the Great Recession, we have not had the home ownership rate has not recovered. We have a whole generation that has lost wealth that has never come back. And it's really important for us to not make those mistakes again, to not think that we can sort of ignore what's going on in one part of our community and basically blame the victim and assume that what comes for one part of our community won't come for the rest of us eventually.
Thanks, Heather. Dick, when we think about some of the examples that Heather cites in her book, we know that one of the results that we tend to see in the data is segregation. And it's segregation in the neighborhoods, it's segregation in the schools, segregation in the churches sometimes. Mm-hmm. And we know that this can have an ill effect on health and opportunity and wealth and even empathy. And Heather shows very clearly that segregation works against all of us at the end of the day. But we remain segregated. So what ideas can you think of or have you had over the course of your career to try to really make us a more inclusive community and break down those barriers of segregation?
Well, we're all familiar with Brown versus Board in 1954. And up until that time, there was really some questions about segregation in the public schools. Of course, that was an area that I've been very involved with. Brown versus Board said it's unconstitutional to have segregation in a public school. And coming out of that, then, we really should have gotten busy and dealt with that issue because that's what the Constitution required. And that's the right thing to do. Well, we didn't. We 1 year passed, 2 years passed. Finally, we had the case then here in Greenville, Ken, if you recall, in like 1970, where the federal court said everything in Greenville had to be totally integrated. Everything in the public school system, teachers in a school, principals, coaches, staff, everything all of a sudden had to be totally integrated. We had a Furman professor that headed up a task force. I was on the task force in Greenville, deciding how we were going to handle all of that with this federal order on us. Well, we did, and I'm very proud that there was a video made of that integration with grace and style. How did it happen? People wonder, but I'll tell you, people, white and people of color, come together when you get a real reason to come together and a movement to have that happen. So we really integrated every single thing in Greenville, every school and so forth. And frankly, we should have done it years before that, but it has really made a big difference. And we have a very good school system now. It's a big system. But thank goodness we did finally come together and do that. As long as it was segregated, there was just no progress really made just about at all. So this business of doing away with segregation, while the Constitution helped us with it, certainly with the public schools, it was the right thing to do. And I'm very proud of the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice then was a former Republican governor. And it's amazing what a major decision that was.
Thanks, Dick. Thank you. Heather, in your book, you talk a lot about public goods. And I think as an economist, some of those are really, really fascinating to me. And I hadn't thought about them in exactly the way that you portray them in the book and the connection to racism. Can you give us an example of a public good that was inhibited, removed, diminished, that had connections to structural racism in your view?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I want to add on to something that Secretary Riley said about Brown v. Board of Education. There's a chapter in my book called Living Apart where I do talk about education and segregation. And one of the most amazing things that I learned in the course of writing the book and researching it was that, Brown v. Board of Education was decided, unanimous decision, totally changing the history of the country in so many ways. And the kind of rationale that the Supreme Court justices used was that there could be no true equality with segregation, and that they really relied on some sociology at the time that had looked at what a segregated system does to school children, right? What are we communicating to our children when we segregate them? And of course, there were so many ways in which that was sending harmful messages to Black children, that they were inferior. Everybody maybe remembers the doll test, the famous doll test, where little Black children sort of know to want a white doll because they know that that's a quote unquote better doll, even when they're children. But interestingly, the sociologists spent a good chunk of their research talking as well about something that the court didn't really mention in its decision, which was that segregation was bad for white children too. And that it was basically morally distorting them, that it was telling them, we believe in fairness and justice and, everyone is equal. And yet we have this system that is violating our values. There are all of these different ways that it basically really said that segregation has a cost to us all. And so I just wanted to lift that up in the conversation about why we would want to integrate and why we would want to keep working for integration, even in the absence of a court order in schools. That we've now learned that diversity, truly being able to learn from people who are different from you, who have different backgrounds and assumptions and ways of seeing the world, makes you smarter, a better critical thinker, makes groups more productive, and that's the kind of superpower that diversity really can be, but only if we set up conditions where everyone can really contribute. So to your question about the public goods, the central metaphor at the heart of the book is the story of what happened to public swimming pools in America. There used to be nearly 2,000 that were mostly built in the 1930s and 40s as part of this larger kind of government ethos that came out of the Great Depression, this sense that, okay, the government has a right and responsibility to build things in the national interest, to ensure a decent standard of living for our people. And that really created what we now know as the American dream, the greatest middle class the world had ever seen. And these swimming pools, for those of y'all in the South, know that it's not just a nice thing to have, it's a pretty essential thing to have, certainly before air conditioning. And community builders were saying this is really important to us. And so we had these grand resort style pools. And I remember actually in my research for the book, as I was studying all these different places where these publicly funded swimming pools were, there was one in Greenville as well, the Cleveland Park one, where there was the pool was, as so often they were across the country, and I'm always quick to note, not just in Jim Crow South, they were segregated, often in the North and the Midwest and the West. There may not have been a whites only sign, but you were not allowed to go if you were Black, and it was very clear through intimidation and violence that the pools were off limits. And so across the country, there were these segregated pools. And I used the idea of the public pools as sort of a way to talk about all the other public goods that came out during that period of time in the 1930s and 40s, whether it was Social Security or the massive investment in housing, the mortgage and housing developments we talked about, even the labor protections, minimum wage and overtime laws, the GI Bill, all of that was part of this sort of public goods social contract. And virtually everything I just described had some sort of racial limitation. And I go through in the book the ways in which the New Deal was racially limited and exclusionary, either explicitly, like in the housing market, or just by carving out certain sectors of employment, like Social Security, or being like the GI Bill, which was race neutral on its face, but often had racist administration. And so the drained pool is what I use in the book to talk about what happened when integration came to public swimming pools. Apparently, according to the research I've done, in 1963, there was a desegregation order for the Cleveland Park pool. And in reaction to that, which is what happened across the country, instead of integrating the pool, the town went through a series of hijinks basically to ultimately end the pool altogether. And the first thing that happened was sea lions were introduced, and it became a place where people weren't supposed to swim, but rather, it was sort of an aquatic park for animals. Apparently, according to these oral histories that I was reading, people still swam nonetheless, and they just left the sea lions to one side. But eventually, the pool was drained and paved over, and that happened across the country. And so the drained pool, for me, began to help me see what happened to a basic assumption in the United States that most white Americans had, that the government should do a lot to make sure that everyone had a decent chance and a high standard of living. But that was based on the supposition that the everyone only included people that they had been taught were good, right? Public goods only for people who are seen as good. And then once in the 1960s and late 1950s, you began to expand the promise of public goods to everyone who had contributed to our nation's economic prosperity. Then that basic assumption that the government had a right and responsibility began to fray. And you began to see a massive shift in public opinion, particularly among Americans who are white, as to what they thought the government should do. And, in many ways, when we've seen the stagnation of the minimum wage to go from being something that could keep a family, comfortable and out of poverty in the 1960s to one that ensures poverty for, a three-person household today, that's a kind of emblematic pull away, turning their backs on the formula that actually had created really their own families' prosperity. Because of a sense of racial resentment, a sense that government had overstepped its bounds in integration, and that if you have to share it with people that you don't think are good people or that you don't think are worthy, then you'd rather not have it at all.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Some of your examples in your book really focused on how people were able to divide and conquer. That is to say, use race as a tool of division so that they could really impose some policy or some law that would then have this external effect on whites as well. And I thought those arguments were really cogent and really powerfully delivered in your book. But I want to turn to Dick now for a second. Dick, you're legendary for your ability to build coalitions and bring people together around a common goal. You got the people of South Carolina to vote for the penny sales tax increase. And so as you reflect on what you read in Heather's book, where you have people working to divide us, and maybe that's more powerful today than it's ever been. What are your thoughts about how we can continue to try to work against that and bring people together?
Well, of course, the pandemic has really controlled so much over the last year and a half, 2 years. Really, it has caused people really to look at inwardly at their families and whatever to decide more about how important that is, the unity that we need in this United States of America. The one thing that I have always supported, and it's been very successful around, is what we call community schools, where the school, the public school, is the center of community. That coupled with a strong after-school program, supported often by retired people, something that Ollie certainly could get involved with. But to have the school then, the place where everybody, black and white and whatever, come together for that center of their community. Where you can do that, it really is successful. The fact is, you make the great point in the book that really, I remember the study, the human genome study that came out in 2003. International study said that there was zero difference in people of different races in terms of their brain ability, intellectual ability, and their physical ability. However, a lot of people are different because they don't have the same opportunities coming up. A lot of them are subtle and a lot of them are real. So we see that happening, and we really need to notice that and do something about it. You have to give the government, the Congress credit. For example, Title I goes to low-income people. It should be more carefully used, I think. But the President, Biden, has now called for a significant increase in Title I. Pell Grants that certainly help with higher education costs, which is an enormous problem in higher education. Community colleges are paying a good difference in that. The point you make in your book is really, I never have really looked at the economics of race as you have, and I think that's very helpful. But you point out very clearly that these things that are harmful to one group is also harmful to the other. Same with the swimming pool. I mean, the white kids use the swimming pool more than the black kids. And you get that, you bring that basic, but you can bring that down, and you did, in a very good way to look at all of the different factors out there, and what's bad for one is bad for the other. And this idea of zero sum, as you talk about it, that a lot of people think that by helping blacks takes away from whites. That's kind of a white supremacy thinking. That is absolutely wrong. And I think you prove that in your book, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Dick. I have a question for both of you now. So race is a really difficult topic for Americans, I think. For people who haven't experienced it, many of them have a hard time believing that it exists. For those that have experienced it, it has been so powerful and so damaging and so heavy that it has changed their world in ways that we can't even articulate in some cases. We have difficulty talking about race. Give us your thoughts about how you think we can best move forward as a country in thinking about race and improving our understanding of race and really coming together in a better way. Heather, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So, I have a lot of compassion for people who are at all different places in their journey to really understand our collective inheritance on racism. We were not well served by our education. Not a single one of us, right? No matter where we went to school, no matter what, we learned from, whose names were commemorated, who were cast in bronze, what politicians talked about, what our family, what our pastor talked about. We've not gotten the whole story. And there has been a real vested interest in robbing us of our shared history. And so oftentimes, because of that desire to minimize the extent and the deliberateness of the racial discrimination throughout our history, it is easy today to minimize its impacts and its effects. Most people don't know about redlining. Now, I remember I was talking this summer to a woman who's from Oklahoma. Her name is Rachel. She's a white suburban mother of 3. And she was outraged in our conversation. She said, I grew up in Oklahoma. I lived in Oklahoma all my life. I was educated in Oklahoma public schools from kindergarten through grad school. And I never learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre until a couple of years ago, of 1921. She said, I was outraged about this. I felt like I'd been lied to. Like, why was somebody keeping that information from me, she said. And she said, I remember driving through a black neighborhood in Tulsa with my dad when I was a little kid. And I noticed that the black neighborhood was poorer. And I asked him why. And he basically just said, black people aren't good with money. They don't know how to take care of their neighborhood. And he didn't say anything about the race massacre. And she said, I feel like if I had known that part of our history, which was not just black history, it's our history, she said, all of us in Tulsa, all of us Oklahomans, then I would have understood a little bit better what I was seeing. And I wouldn't have let negative stereotypes fill in the space where that absence of history was. And then later on we talked and she said, I just learned something new for the first time about that neighborhood, Greenwood in Tulsa, the Black Wall Street, which is that even after the massacre and the firebombing and the systematic non-payment of insurance claims afterwards, the town, people rebuilt it, and it was thriving again in the 1950s. There were 40 Black-owned grocery stores, hundreds of Black-owned businesses and middle-class folks. And then in 1970, the federal government decided to use eminent domain to run a highway through that neighborhood. And so again, you saw systemic racism destroy the wealth of this community. And she said to me, if I had known that when I was driving through that neighborhood in the late 1980s, I would have been a different person and been a different kind of neighbor to my black neighbors in Tulsa. Now, I tell that kind of long story just because I think stories are helpful in us really understanding what's at stake in having this conversation, in everybody reclaiming their right to think freely, to learn, to know, to not let there be censorship over the ideas that are our own birthright, all of us, white, black, and brown, indigenous in this country. This is our history, and frankly, there's not so much of it. We've only been around for that long, Some countries, the children have to learn hundreds of years of dynasties, thousands of years of dynasties. We don't have that much history that we have to learn. People on the stage have lived, a good third or a quarter of it, right? I mean, we really don't have that much that we need to learn, and yet we've been robbed of it. And so I think that there is right now a real hunger in this country for people to, reclaim their knowledge over the forces that have shaped the way we live today. And people are wanting to ask questions about, why do we live so apart? Why are all the black people over there? Why do we have the highest incarceration rate in the world outside of Russia? What is going on with our society? People want to know. And then, of course, there are forces that want to keep us ignorant. And the reason they want to keep us ignorant is so that we are easily manipulated and that we continue to believe stereotypes instead of trusting and listening to one another.
Thank you, Heather. Secretary Riley, what is it in your mind that gives you hope that we're going to get better and we're going to be able to find the path forward?
Well, I think human beings are inclined to have a heart, absolutely, in my judgment, as I point out time and time again, public education really is what kind of brings us all together. When we came out of the the secretary's office, the three things that I added to Goals 2000, which was the big bill describing education in America. One was civics. That's very important of what we are talking about. People who understand the system, who know how, what it's all about and why things are happening and so forth. The second one is art. That to have a good education in America, you should have a good knowledge of civics, a good knowledge of art. Art brings everybody together automatically. The third thing was foreign language. Of course, people who speak two languages, you don't want to discriminate against them. So I think as you think about ways, and I talk about policy, and you talk a lot about policy too, it gets down to what we're doing, really what's happening. And I think that if we give them all the tools, we give funding for rural poor schools, helping out in every way we can with the government, with policy. But we get down to the point we all have to either love each other or not. And this great country of ours is the United States. And if we are to survive through global warming and everything else, we've got to come together. And I hope our leaders will show that.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you. We've got time for a question or two, perhaps only one at this point, I think. And I've chosen one, Heather, that brings us back to sort of where you started with your pathway. This is a question from the audience, and the writer is saying, I just wonder, what is it that keeps you going? When our brothers and sisters are murdered, when there's partisanship, and the partisanship is extreme, when you see racism all around you, what do you say to yourself on those hard days? And how do you get through them? And what pulls you forward?
Well, what a compassionate question. Thank you so much. I say to myself that my ancestors had to face far more with far less, and they made it through, and they beat the odds, and they made it possible for me and my young family to be on this planet and to have all that we have and all that we're able to give back. And it's really in being in touch with and having sort of a touchstone of your ancestors that helps me. There's a lot of frustration that we are still seeing so much death, so much inequality, so much self-sabotage, that we still haven't sort of learned the lessons of our history. And I have moments where I'm deeply frustrated. And certainly this project of finding racism everywhere has been something that has been quite sobering. But at the same time, it feels like, there is this common thread, right? Underlying so much of our dysfunction, so many of the questions we ask, which is like, why can we just not get this together? Why can't we be better on these other issues, whether it's school funding or healthcare or, poverty wages or climate change? And when you see that there's this common thread sabotaging us, it does feel somehow actually easier to think, well, if we can just yank out that thread, then we can make progress on so many of these other issues. It's really all within our reach. We just have to link up arms together across lines of race in order to get there.
Heather, thank you so much. I just want to let you know that Secretary Riley will be around for a bit after the program is over if you have any additional questions. But let's take a moment and thank Heather McGhee and Dick Riley.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Mr. Riley, for inviting me and for creating this institute. Thank you to Furman. What a beautiful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather. Next up, we welcome a panel of local leaders who are going to take what we've just heard from Heather and Dick and help us understand what this looks like in Greenville. As they come to the stage, I invite you to look at the screen for some compelling data uncovered by two reports commissioned by the United Way of Greenville County. One is the Greenville County Racial Equity Index, and the other is Neighborhood Change in Greenville County, which was a collaboration between Furman University and the United Way.
Good evening. That was an insightful conversation we had, or we listened to, with author Heather McGhee, Secretary Riley, and Dr. Ken Peterson. We got the opportunity to hear how structural racism exists in aspects of our society that we may have thought were already rooted out, but they still exist today. And so in just a little bit, we're going to talk about what about home? What do things look like here? But first, I would love to introduce the speakers up on the stage with me. And by the way, I'm Felicia Edie. I'm a reporter with South Carolina Public Radio and South Carolina ETV. And sitting next to me is, and of course I have it out of order on my paper. But sitting next to me is Megan Barb. She is president and CEO of United Way of Greenville County. And next to her, we have Lillian. Help me out here. Oh, you know what? It will be easier if I just read it off the computer. But sitting next to her, we have a wonderful individual who has she's dedicated 40 years of her life to public service here in this area. So we have the Honorable Lillian Brock Fleming, Mayor Pro Tem of Greenville City Council, former educator, taught math, and also 40 years on City Council. And next to her, we have David Lomanek, Market President of South Carolina for TD Bank. Thank you all so very much for joining us on this beautiful evening, this beautiful campus, for a very insightful and crucial conversation. So again, we heard really insightful information from the conversation just a little while ago. And so now what we want to talk about is what things look like here in Greenville County. What are the organizations, the programs, who are the community leaders working to dismantle structural racism and in its place build an equitable and fair system where all Americans can build wealth and therefore the American dream? And so Lillian, I want to start with you because through your lens, we can get a snapshot or a timeline, if you will, of the history of this area. You're a lifelong resident and dedicated so much of your years here working as a public servant. So through your lens, as we have seen Greenville County grow, tell us about how it was, how it's grown, and some of the challenges or issues or questions that you see needs to be addressed.
Thank you so much. I actually was a little kid when they closed the swimming pool in Cleveland Park. And they did replace they put seals in the particular swimming park at that time, did not allow the children to swim. And well, as it will, they investigated, but somehow all of the seals perished in the community. And a lot of people in the Black community assumed that it was just God's way of getting us back for being evil, which probably was not a bad thought at that particular time. But in Greenville, houses were, well, as most of the things that you see before, you had little shanty houses. We all Black people at that time were living in certain areas. Even I remember the time when you had the first Black homeowners. I was a real tiny child, and they talked about it because it was a wonderful thing, and where they were located, because Blacks were not really allowed to own property per se. You lived in a rented house, et cetera. And of course, you paid the same thing for it as if it was a nice house. There wasn't necessarily heat in the house. You had to put your own heat in there. Now, when I first got on city council, there was not a law that even allowed a rental agent in order to put a heating unit in a house. Now, that was in the 80s. So I'm just saying that it has come a long way. It just was a different kind of setting. There was, we had a curfew during one period of time because Black and white teenagers were fighting because of something that happened at one of the schools. So therefore, and the kids were working, and so then you had those issues. So Blacks were on the curfew at that time. So that went on several times during my time as a teenager. So there were certain things you just did not do, and you just did not go. A lot of people are learning about the talk. In the African-American community, your parents gave you the talk because you were a person of color and they wanted you to continue to live. So there were certain things you were told you could not do, you could not go. There were certain places you did not walk, particular boys. And I can even remember my 16-year-old ran track. He was an alternate for the 1996 Olympics. I was so proud of him. But at the time, he was in high school before he got to that point. And he had a little job. He could work 4 hours in the evening. And he would run home because it was 2 blocks from where he worked to our house. And he was stopped and asked for his identification. He was 16 years old. And then when he explained to the police officers where he lived, they recognized it was my house. They asked him, why didn't he tell them that he was my child? My son said, and I was so proud of him, I still beam when I think about it. He said, why should it matter? I'm just a kid running. I'm not running from anything, I'm just running. Exercising because I'm on the track team because I'm going to be a good runner. So there were different things. Greenville, it was said at one time that Greenville didn't have a lot of problems in terms of racism. I am here to say that as a child, that was not true. That was not true in terms of integration and other things. As a 15-year-old, my parents allowed me to be able to go and help to register people to vote. At that time, you had to be 21. And we would try to knock on doors of people that we knew, people of color. They were so terrified to vote. They would not let you into their house. It could be your own cousins. They would not open the door, particularly if somebody was driving by who they thought saw them. The president of the NAACP, his home was burned down, his business was bombed. At my church, a group came with a cross to burn it in front of my church, Mountain View Baptist Church. As children, we learned that our preacher was a hero. He said to the men that if you light this cross here, there will be a resurrection and a crucifixion, and it definitely will not be Jesus. And about that time, all of the deacons rose up behind him to support him. So those kind of things went on. And I was just an ordinary kid. So I thought at that time, so if I experienced it, others experienced probably something even worse. My cousin was spit on when we carried voter registration forms to the courthouse. And being young people who were trained by the NAACP at that time, we were not to respond. We were to dress neatly. And if someone did say or do something to you, you were not to retaliate. Now, I'm gonna tell you now, I know that wouldn't work for my children today or any others, but that's the way we were trained, because we were taught that to respond to violence with violence did not win.
You know, the information that we got recently from the most recent census
Yes.
shows that Greenville County is one of the fastest growing counties in the state.
Yes.
And you can see evidence of that when you drive through the area. You can see the growth, you can see the renewal, you can see the expansion. Gentrification, and we just heard in the conversation about how structural racism exists when it comes to housing. Gentrification and affordable housing are issues that you have dedicated your life to throughout your career on city council. What can and should city and county governments do to support communities of color when it comes to housing?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, and I appreciate the work that the city council, I have one vote, but I also have a voice as well. We asked the city, I asked the other city council members that we need to change our process. Community development in the city for most municipalities is funds that comes from the federal government in order to help to reduce poverty. Well, for 12 consecutive years, probably now 13, community development has been cut. And so therefore, you're behind in a lot of things. So in 2017, when we did a study of gentrification and housing, we need to know how many houses did we need to have in the city of Greenville so that poor people could live. Well, our study said 2,500 homes were needed in order to be able to handle the poverty. And so it seems that just 10 years prior to that, we had a surplus of 800 homes for affordable people. In that short 10-year period, we needed 2,500. That's because slowly and surely people were moving and taking and moving and taking and destroying and moving the homes and the quality of homes in the community. So therefore, it was so our city then, I asked that we to get $2 million from our surplus, because every year, if you budget your money right, you have a surplus. Well, we were in shock first to have a surplus because most people knew about the economy. And we asked the auditor, was he sure that he was looking at the numbers right? Well, he said he was. So we asked that we had surplus, why not take $2 million? Now, don't ask me where 2 million came, it just sounded good at the time. And so it was more than what we were doing from general funds. Normally, cities did not take money from their general fund to help anybody. They normally took money, possibly it was a business, but they never took money from general funds to help build houses for the poor. So we decided, we voted, all of our council members didn't have to be coerced. All of them felt it was a great idea to start a process. And so we asked for $2 million to begin a process. We then voted to have a housing trust fund. The housing trust fund was already there. We had created it in the late 90s, but we didn't use it. But so we moved it to a separate entity. It was a part of Community Works, had been there, set in place as well. And we moved them to help begin a process of investing. Not just the $2 million is gonna run out sometime, but to invest in the community. So that's what we did in the city of Greenville. And we tried to encourage others to do the same, but oftentimes, you know, without vision, people perish. So sometimes people don't necessarily follow your lead, they just do. whatever.
Megan, I want to come to you now. The United Way is probably one of the most recognizable names when it comes to organizations working to advance communities in education, income, and housing and wealth. We saw on the slides a little while ago some of the information from the studies that your organization commissioned, and a lot of it was jaw-dropping. The ones that stuck out to me, we saw increases in family and individual poverty, decreases in incomes, increases in rent. I think the one that was most blaring was in Greenville County, 22.5% of Black children and 30.2% of Hispanic children live in areas of concentrated poverty, and that's compared to only 4.8% of white children. Through the lens of the work that you do at the United Way, how are you guys working to fix these problems, to change these numbers?
Yeah, jaw dropping is the right phrase to use for what you saw up on the screen. And in 2018, we partnered with Furman University to better understand actually the tale of two cities. And you could argue that it's also the tale of two counties in a lot of ways. When it comes to education, health, income, wealth, you name it. If you look at all of those different factors, our African-American neighbors are faring much worse than their white counterparts. So it's important to us to not only look at data telling us that story, but we also wanted to engage the community. And so what was unique about the Furman partnership is that, yes, it was quantitative, that was really important, but it was also qualitative. We actually talked to our neighbors in the community to say, what's important to you? What's important to you for your family, for your livelihood? And it may be surprising to some, it wasn't surprising to us. They want the same exact things that we're looking for in more affluent neighborhoods or middle-class neighborhoods in Greenville or the surrounding county. Safe neighborhoods, quality transportation, quality education, access to healthcare. It's all the things that we're talking about every single day. And you've heard this pop up in the conversation this evening about proximity, the proximity to people to say what's important to you and engaging them in those very solutions. So we're really interested in United Way at doing more than just admiring data and having those conversations. We're also interested in bringing people together from across the community to problem solve for some of those most important issues. It informs our investment strategies at United Way, but it also informs our partnerships and our collaboration that we do throughout. So yes, the neighborhood change study, really, really important. By the way, that data is interactive. It's on a website, inclusivegvl.org. You can zoom into very specific neighborhoods in Greenville County and look at the data to tell the story of all the things that we're focusing on. So that's a really important aspect of this. Increasingly, it was important to us to build upon that data and look very specifically at the factors impacting the African-American community. So from there, we commissioned the Race Equity Index, which looked at all of those factors very specifically. And the big takeaway from that, including all the data that was flashing up on the screens, the big takeaway from that is we have to ask ourselves, why are so many African-American people suffering in our community? It's very easy to go from point A to point B here and not see those disparities. We are accelerating growth like crazy. That's no secret in Greenville County. It's a hidden aspect of our community and quite frankly, one that we should all be concerned about for the many reasons that Heather spoke about and Secretary Riley covered as well. So that's important to our core and it informs every single thing that we do, including the Race Equity and Economic Mobility Commission that I know we'll talk more about as well.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you see through the partners that you work with and programs through United Way in accomplishing these goals? And then what are some programs or some examples of successes?
Yeah, great question. So I sometimes joke that my role at United Way is the chief mythbuster of the organization. And when we first started releasing the neighborhood change study and the Race Equity Index, there was a lot of disbelief. There was a lot of, this isn't happening in our community. This isn't happening in Greenville or Greenville County. We're better than this. So we had a lot of fact checkers with people who went back to their desks or their offices and looked at the data for themselves and came back and said, oh my gosh, this is true. This is happening right here. And we have to do something about it. So that was sort of number one, is that education. I'm not a big fan of shame and blame. I'm a big believer in inviting people to the table, meeting them where they are. It's all about relationships. It's all about bringing people together and understanding their point of view. So that's core to the work that we do. So I think the biggest challenge was first educating, but what I love about Greenville and what I love about Greenville County is that people are really willing to roll up their sleeves and be part of the solution. I have yet to meet someone here who says, I'm out, I'm not interested in doing that. Once people understand the information, understand the challenge, we like a good challenge in Greenville County, and we also like to be the best at things. So I feel inspired by that. It's a challenge of getting people around the table, but there's a lot of hope and optimism too, that if any community can solve some of these challenges, I believe that it's this one, and I see that every day in the spirit of our community members.
A good challenge and rolling up the sleeves, rolling up sleeves. David, you are a part of an organization, the acronym is REAM. I would like for you to introduce and explain what that is, and then I'm going to come back with another question.
Okay, very good. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here, Riley Institute and President Davis. And it's always good to be with Megan and Lillian. So I've got to condense about a 1 hour history of REAM into about 5 minutes or less. So I will do my best to do that, but I will say to you, please go to our website, which is reemgvl.org. It's a website we're continuing to put information out on. It gives you the history of REAM, and I hope you will take some time to look through that. Last summer, in the wake of some very unfortunate, invisible deaths across this country in the Black community, the Urban League, the Greenville Chamber, and the United Way CEOs came together and said, listen, Greenville is a great place, but we have our own problems. No, that issue didn't happen in downtown Greenville, but we have our own problems, and we can be a better community. So they really kind of sent an open letter to the community to say we can be better, and everybody said, well, all right, well, you figure it out. And so Megan and Carlos and Sean got together and formed a 35-person commission with representation from the nonprofit sector, the education sector, the healthcare sector, clearly criminal justice, the professional sector, community activists. I mean, you name it, we've got those folks in the room. And I was honored to be asked, along with Judge Merle Code, who many of you know has a long history in this community, to co-chair this commission, who started last August. And the idea was, okay, by December of last year, we'll have a great report for the community, and we'll be off and running. Clearly, when you enter this work, you find out that you're not going to solve the problems in 5 months, right, Lillian? And we had to ask every commissioner to serve at least another year and get us through the end of this year. We took all of the commissioners, and we're in 5 different committees: criminal justice, healthcare, income and wealth, education, and community-wide learning. And each of the commissioners is working with a facilitator and experts around this community to come up with ideas, suggestions, recommendations to bring forth to the broader commission, so that by the end of this year, we can come out to the community, the Greenville community, and say, here's what we want this community to rally around. Here's why we think these are important recommendations. It is important to point out, particularly given the previous discussion and some of the points that Megan made, we are truly grounding this work in the data. One of the first meetings with all the commissioners, we put all of that Racial Equity Institute or index data up on the screen and started looking through that. Megan talked about some of the jaw-dropping numbers. It was very sobering. But we have learned that if you ground the conversation in the data, it can sometimes remove a little bit of maybe the personal bias that someone may bring to the conversation. And we have had some very uncomfortable and tough conversations in that room, but that's also, we all clearly know and believe that's how we're going to move this community forward. Last thing I'll say about REAM, we are very, very sensitive and focused on making sure that this does not end on December the 31st of 2021. Too many of these types of commissions and reports, we say all the time, they put together a fancy notebook and they put it out in the community, and everybody says, those are great ideas. And then nobody does anything. It goes up on the shelf, and a couple of years later, nobody even remembers what REAM stands for. We're 100% committed to making sure that does not happen with this commission in this community. So we have spent an equal amount of time trying to figure out what the sustainability plan is. I'm not ready to make any big announcements today, but we are having some active conversations with organizations that will potentially own REAM going forward, and making sure that someone or a group of people wake up every morning in Greenville County thinking about how do we move what we've talked about in REAM and these recommendations forward in this community.
We heard in the conversation and in Lillian's intro, and many of you, I'm sure, have your own anecdotal stories as well, but we know that the problems that we are trying to solve are very long. They've existed for a really long time. So as each of you work within your respective spaces, what can local governments and people in this auditorium, people watching via Zoom, what can they do to come alongside you and to help you help the community? Very briefly.
Yeah, for me, and when I think about United Way, I go back to the concept of proximity. Everyone has a role to play in this, right? This is not just an issue in the African-American community for the African-American community to uniquely solve. So for me, it's proximity, it's being an ally. If you are white in our community and doing your part to be an ally, it's important, I think, to engage where it makes sense for you to engage, learn about the different topics, learn about the different issues. For the REAM Commission, there's a huge amount of community engagement that's possible there. So again, I invite you to visit our website at reamgvl.org to look at those opportunities as well as ways to get engaged.
Well, one of the things, as we've said, particularly on city council, I'm on so many different boards and Boy Scouts and everything, Girl Scouts, you name it, because I feel that is the only way that we're going to make a difference. The one issue I've always been concerned about is that when we got rid of social workers in the state of South Carolina some 20 or 30 years back, we didn't realize how difficult that was. Oftentimes, I can truthfully say that the people who need the help very seldom are online, very seldom have an iPhone, very seldom take the newspaper, so they don't get the information. So if it's got to be by word of mouth or something in order to help people, particularly the elderly people. But the other thing in listening to what the others have said is that somebody has to wake up every day thinking about it. And you have to be a member of it. I'm a member, a life member of the Greenville NAACP. So many people think just because it says colored people, that it is just Black people. The NAACP was started in 1906 by 48 whites and 6 Blacks. They met in Niagara Falls because Blacks and whites could not meet together here in America. So they met because of the lynching and the hatred, and they wanted to stop that. If we want to stop anything else, we have to continue to meet. We're religiously segregated. We homes are segregated. So we've got to begin to talk. A conversation will help bridge the gap. So we need to work together, no matter what. And you need to be interested. If something happens just to Black children, is that the reason why, which is a question that one of my grandchildren asked me, is that the reason why people don't care? I can't answer that question because I am Black myself and I care. So we've got to care more and do more and quit being those Sunday Christians, the ones just go to the building and pretend that you know who the Lord is. But then you don't care about feeding the homeless. You don't care about clothing the naked, and you don't care about mistreatment of the dying. We've got to make a difference. That's what will happen. My son said in a sermon at Clemson University when he was preaching there in the interracial meeting, he said, until white men become very active in issues that affect discrimination and hatred, it will not have any effect. That is the truth in South Carolina. Now, it might be an issue that people may be upset about, but it's the truth. And until the truth is told and people hear the truth and listen to it and respond to it, we will be sitting here the same time, 10 years from today, talking about how we can move forth. I mean, when they got the idea, when the United Way put it there, and they put it there several times. I've been working with the United Way for the last 40 or 50 years. They have been doing the same thing, trying to get people involved to do the information. And as you said, they're committed not to let it die. Until that type of commitment is done, we're gonna still be sitting, coming back, doing the same thing every year. Truth has to be told.
I will say just very quickly, and then I'll specifically answer your question to the conversation that was had before we got up here with respect to home ownership. Our Income and Wealth Committee is clearly talking about how do we improve home ownership in Greenville County. And the city, as Lillian clearly knows and has been a leader on, has done a lot. She just talked about some of those things with the Greenville Housing Trust Fund, but partnerships are going to be important. But we all clearly know one of the best ways to build generational wealth is through home ownership. So that is going to be, I think, one of the top priorities from our Income and Wealth Committee through REAM. I would just say, in terms of getting engaged and involved, please do visit the website. We are starting to host some events out in the community. You can have the opportunity to participate in those. We're going to start hosting more and more focus groups to begin sharing some of our draft recommendations and give the community a chance to weigh in on those recommendations, give us feedback. So look for those opportunities to be engaged, but it is going to take a little bit of effort on your part because we can't get to every citizen in the city of Greenville or Greenville County, but we'll do our best to get as many people around the table to give feedback about what we're working on. And again, we've got several events coming up we'd love for you to be a part of.
Thank you, each of you, for those responses. We have some questions from the audience, and hopefully we'll get a chance to get to a few of them. Here is one. It says, Greenville's West End is undergoing rapid gentrification. Middle-class whites are moving in and displacing Black residents. How can we create more equitable developments that minimize Black displacement and supports development of Black businesses?
Okay. Well, you have to develop a development yourself. That's one of the things, is that we have to have investment in development in the area. And let me be clear, the West End is not the only place that's being gentrified. In America, every place, because of the change when the economy went down and people start seeing cheap property, they did this all over. You can go to any of the communities all over America, you're gonna see the same thing. The west side of Greenville that covers the West End, and that covers West Greenville, and it covers southern side, and it stops right there at Hampton Pinckney, and it's being in other places. So it's being gentrified, but what needs to happen is more people need to invest. Now, here's the problem, the big problem. We can do as much as we can do with our investment, but until the state of South Carolina has a law that allows us to tell Megan, you can build these 24 units, but 10% of them better be for poor people. I can't do that right now. We have begged developers, and because some of them have the love of God in their heart, they will do it. But we can't make them do it. Because if it was required, then every development you see would have a place for the least of these. It would be called mixed-use property. You'll have the very rich, you'll have working people, you'll have working people who are at a lower level, and then you have the very poor, but they will be blended in such a way that they'll be able to begin to live together. So that's what's got to happen. The state needs to pass the inclusion law. But until that happens, we just have to hope and pray. Hope and pray. Trust me, folks. Jill Littlejohn, when she was on council, we begged and pleaded with one developer who was doing 190 units. Please, we voted against their project because it says we just can't seem to work it out. I'm saying to myself, you're gonna be charging these people $1,800 a month. Surely you could take $10 or $20 and throw it together and put a couple of units somewhere else. No.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
You know, the only other thing that I'll add to your comments, Lillian, is one of the things that emerged from the Race Equity Index was, excuse me, the one area that African Americans are thriving in our community is around small businesses and entrepreneurship. And I think that point around investment is so important. We know that during COVID-19, which continues to be a challenge, as we all know, that has been disrupted for a lot of African Americans, but that is one area in our community that has really been thriving. So I echo that real need to continue to invest in small business owners and entrepreneurs.
That's wonderful.
All right, and another question. There is an idea that most of the poor live in cities when the reality is that most of them, Black and white, live in rural areas where schools are drastically underfunded because of poor tax bases. How can this problem be dealt with?
Okay, repeat that again.
Sure.
The first part.
Sure. There is an idea that most of the poor live in cities when the reality is that most of them, Black and white, live in rural areas where schools are drastically underfunded because of poor tax bases. How can this problem be dealt with?
Okay, first of all, that's not necessarily a true statement. A lot of poverty in certain areas, like in West Greenville, we have the city has been building houses, so we have some very clean houses there, although you have people that have low income, and low income does not necessarily mean no income. And that's what a lot of people assume, that poverty means that everybody has zero. That's not necessarily true. Poverty comes when you pay more than 30% of your meaningful income just to live in a house. That's when poverty comes, because you're paying much more than you can afford. And then if you're paying, you got all the other things, you got the utility bills and other things that you have to have. That's when poverty comes, when you're paying out more than you earn. And so that's a problem. But a lot of the schools are in our state along the I-95 corridor. Shame, there's a different income level there. And yes, that is the problem. And there's a lot of poverty in that area, and the schools are totally underfunded. This back again to the state budget again. Hello. They do pretty good sometimes, but if they would ever fully fund the 1 cent sales tax and give it to the schools and quit giving it to somebody else, God knows we could live. When Dick Riley was there, God help us, that was the only time we ever had some fully funding. My God, he left and they went crazy. Well, he went to Washington, tried to help them out too, bless your heart.
I will just jump in maybe on that question, and maybe even more specifically the one before. Greenville's success has come from its ability to partner in the public and private sector. And with most complex social and community issues, that sort of partnership is going to be a requirement in order to be successful.
Thank you.
Because if you look at just good old-fashioned supply and demand and cost and everything else, it's hard to convince a developer to pay full price for everything to build something and then give parts of it away for free, unless, to your point, Lillian, they just have a really big heart.
Yes.
But there are ways to entice a developer in that specific case to do those sort of projects. There are low-income housing tax credits. There are mill tax credits if you convert an old mill. There are new market tax credits for businesses. I mean, there are lots of different ways that the public sector and the private sector can partner together. Banks can invest in community financial institutions that can do some of this lending, particularly on the housing front. So there are tons of ways to do this, but we've got to just be willing to do it and get around the table and talk about what are those partnerships? How do we make sure everybody's at the table? And how do we make sure everybody's doing their part for the greater good?
Yeah, thank you so much. You're exactly right, because our economic development director, Merle Johnson, who's here, he spends most of his time trying to get partners because you can't get it all at one time.
quickly, this question makes me think about where people live. Is there, as the city continues to grow, as this area grows, is there a concern that services that people need, they are no longer geographically able to receive?
Yes,
Or
so
harder to get to those services?
yes, I would say that in Greenville County and specifically in Greenville, we are nonprofit rich, but we're infrastructure poor. So depending on where you live in the county, depending on what you need, it's increasingly harder and harder to get access to those services. And COVID really illuminated a lot of that in the beginning of the crisis, as we needed to partner across a lot of different sectors in a lot of different ways, that people had the intention, they wanted to be able to help this outsized number of people who needed help, but the infrastructure just wasn't there to make that happen. So for sure, I think that's a big challenge that we have in our community, in our county, as people continue to get displaced.
Public transportation is the most horrible thing in Greenville County. And it's not that way everywhere, but that is the biggest problem, because people really cannot get to where they need food. During COVID, we spent time trying to get people food, delivering stuff. Everybody doesn't buy their groceries at Walmart. So, but I'm just saying, and everybody doesn't have that concept. So it was a problem. It has been the biggest problem in terms of helping people, period, is public transportation.
I see great opportunity for people to roll up the sleeves and to do work in this area to improve the communities in this area. I want to thank each and every one of you, each of you, for joining us this evening, and thank you for coming out this evening as well for this crucial conversation. And also, we want to invite you to join us next week for the third and final Straight Talk, Dismantling Racism, Why Change Can Happen Now. That segment will feature 3 dynamic individuals. They are Policy Link's Angela Glover Blackwell, MDC CEO John Simpkins, and Dr. Russell Booker of the Spartanburg Academic Movement. Thank you again for joining us this evening.